Why inmate gangs can't recruit or rule inside ADX Florence Supermax Prison. Smash the subscribe button like it's a panic alarm. Hit like before the door slams shut. And drop a comment if you're ready to step into a place where power goes to die. Because once this story starts, there's no turning back. The lights were already flashing when the convoy reached the outer gate. Red and blue strobes ricocheted off the concrete walls like warning shots, slicing through the pre-dawn darkness of Fremont County, Colorado. Snow dusted the ground in thin, uneven patches, crunching beneath boots as armed officers took their positions. No sirens now, just a low hum of engines idling, the hiss of radios, and the unmistakable tension that comes when everyone knows one wrong move could set off a chain reaction no one could stop. Inside the armored transport sat a man who had once commanded hundreds without ever raising his voice. His name wouldn't appear in this story. Not yet. But inside the federal system, his reputation traveled faster than paperwork. In other prisons, he had been a recruiter, a strategist, a broker of fear. He didn't need tattoos or slogans. He needed proximity, conversation, time, and that was exactly what he was about to lose. ADX Florence rose out of the darkness like a fortress built to swallow men whole. No towers in the traditional sense. No dramatic spotlights sweeping the yard. Just layers of reinforced concrete, steel, and silence, designed not to intimidate, but to erase. As the transport rolled forward, gates opened and closed in sequence, never more than one at a time. Each barrier sealed behind the convoy with a hydraulic thud that felt final, like a verdict being read aloud. Somewhere deep inside the complex, a clock ticked toward a moment that would change the balance of power across multiple prison systems. Because this wasn't just an inmate transfer. It was the end of an organization. 3 hours earlier, nearly 1,000 miles away, a body had been discovered in a place bodies weren't supposed to be found. The man was slumped in a utility corridor beneath a maximum security prison in the Southwest, a location accessible only to staff and inmates with specific clearance. No signs of a struggle. No weapon. Just a single, deliberate act that spoke louder than violence ever could. Investigators would later describe it as clean. Too clean. The victim wasn't a gang member. That was the first red flag. He was a facilitator, a quiet figure who moved information, favors, and access between groups that weren't supposed to communicate. A man who believed he was invisible because no one feared him. He was wrong. By the time the prison went into lockdown, word had already begun to spread through informal channels. Whispers passed during meal rotations, glances exchanged during count. Coded phrases tapped through plumbing and vents. Something had gone wrong. And at the center of it all was a name the Bureau of Prisons had been tracking for years. Special Agent Mara Klein stood in a windowless briefing room, staring at a digital map of federal facilities connected by thin, glowing lines. Each line represented movement, transfers, temporary holds, disappearances that couldn't be explained by paperwork alone. She had spent 15 years following prison gangs from the inside out, watching how they adapted, mutated, and survived every new restriction thrown at them. She knew their playbooks, their rituals, their mistakes. ADX Florence wasn't supposed to be part of this map. "That's what bothers me," she said, breaking the silence. If this was about power, he wouldn't have let himself be moved. Across the table, analyst Jordan Reyes leaned back, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen, unless he didn't have a choice. Klein shook her head. Everyone has a choice, even in cuffs. What Reyes didn't say, what none of them wanted to admit yet, was that ADX Florence represented something gangs couldn't adapt to, not because it was violent, not because it was brutal, but because it was isolating in ways the human mind wasn't built to survive. Recruitment depended on contact. Influence depended on observation. Control depended on presence. ADX Florence stripped all three down to nothing. Still, the timing didn't make sense. The dead facilitator had been the last known link between multiple regional factions. He wasn't supposed to be expendable. Killing him risked exposure, retaliation, collapse, unless the collapse was the point. Back at the facility, the inmate transfer continued with clinical precision. The man stepped out of the transport under floodlights that flattened every feature of his face. No expression, No resistance. His wrists and ankles were secured, movements guided rather than forced. Officers didn't speak to him. There was no need. He looked straight ahead as he was escorted to the Sally Port, past walls designed to absorb sound, into a building where every step was tracked, logged, and reviewed by eyes he would never see. He had spent years cultivating loyalty through shared space, cells, yards, chow halls. He knew how to read men, how to sense weakness, how to plant ideas that grew into obedience. Here, there would be no one to read. The intake process was swift. Fingerprints, scans, medical clearance, psychological baseline assessments conducted by professionals trained to spot manipulation before it formed. Questions were asked, answers recorded, reactions noted. Then came the door. It was thicker than anything he had encountered before. No bars, no window large enough to see through, just a narrow slot and a seam that disappeared into the wall when it closed. Inside, the cell was precise to the inch. Concrete bed, concrete desk, stainless steel fixtures molded into the wall, lights controlled from the outside, temperature regulated remotely, no posters, no personal items, no contact. This was where influence went to starve. But even here, systems weren't perfect. And that was what worried Agent Klein most. 2 days after the transfer, she received an encrypted message flagged as internal priority. It contained a single attachment, a time-stamped audio file, recorded during routine monitoring. She listened to it once. Then again. The sound quality was poor, distorted by layers of security protocols and ambient noise. But beneath it all was something unmistakable. Rhythm, not words, not code, a pattern of taps, pauses, repetitions. Too deliberate to be random, too consistent to be coincidence. ADX Florence was designed to prevent communication between inmates. Cells were positioned to eliminate line of sight. Sound-dampening materials absorbed noise before it could travel. Movement schedules were staggered to ensure isolation. And yet, someone was reaching out, running against the database. Klein said, all known signaling patterns. Everything. Hours later, the results came back with a match that sent a chill through the room. The rhythm mirrored a system used years earlier in a now-defunct penitentiary, one that had been shut down after a federal investigation exposed coordinated activity across supposedly isolated units. The architect of that system? The man now sitting alone in an ADX cell, which meant one thing. ADX Florence hadn't broken him. He had been preparing for this. As night fell over the complex, cameras continued to record nothing out of the ordinary. No disturbances, no violations. Just a man sitting on the edge of his concrete bed, hands folded, eyes closed. To an untrained observer, it would look like surrender. But Agent Klein knew better. She had seen this before. The calm before expansion. The moment when an organization stops growing outward and starts burrowing inward. And somewhere, buried deep in layers of concrete and protocol, a system designed to eliminate gang power was being quietly tested. The next discovery would force the Bureau to confront an impossible question. What if the most secure prison in America wasn't being infiltrated? What if it was being used? Because when technicians reviewed archive surveillance from a completely different facility, one with no official connection to ADX Florence, they found a communication log that shouldn't have existed. A transfer request, pre-approved, signed off weeks before the body was found, and authorized by someone who, according to federal records, had retired 3 years earlier. But when they opened the file to see who requested it, the name at the top changed everything. The name at the top of the file wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It belonged to Thomas Calder, former deputy director of the Bureau of Prisons, officially retired, publicly praised, quietly forgotten, a man whose signature had once moved inmates across state lines with a stroke of a pen, a man who, according to federal databases, no longer had access to anything resembling authority. And yet there was a transfer authorization routed through legacy systems, time-stamped weeks before the facilitator's death. Flagged as routine and never questioned, Agent Mara Klein stared at the screen, the room around her sinking into silence. Calder hadn't just approved a move. He had timed it, The paperwork lined up too neatly with a series of administrative changes, minor policy updates that appeared harmless on their own, adjusted recreation schedules, revised medical intake windows, a software patch pushed quietly through the Bureau's internal network. None of it raised alarms. That was the problem. Pull Calder's post-retirement activity. Klein said, financials, consulting contracts, everything. The results came back uglier than expected. Calder had never truly retired. He had shifted, consulting for private corrections firms, advising on infrastructure upgrades, sitting on review boards that shaped how new facilities, including ADX Florence, implemented automation and inmate management protocols. He hadn't been a gang member. He had been something far more dangerous. A bridge. Inside ADX Florence, the inmate, now referred to internally as Subject H, continues routine with unsettling consistency. He followed every rule, ate every meal, responded to every command with compliance, so perfect it bordered on theatrical. And still, the patterns continued. Inmates housed in completely separate units began submitting identical grievance forms. Same phrasing, same grammatical quirks. Requests that referenced obscure sections of policy manuals most inmates never read. No threats, no demands, just questions. Harmless on the surface. But when analysts mapped the submissions against Subject H's movement schedule, the overlap was undeniable. Each cluster appeared shortly after his limited out-of-cell activity. Never direct, never obvious. Influence without contact, control without command. ADX Florence wasn't designed to stop that because no one believed it was possible. Klein flew to Colorado under a classification that kept her off official rosters. No press, no announcements. Inside the facility, she met with Warden Ellis, a man who had built a career on the belief that ADX was the final solution to organized prison power. Gangs can't rule here, Ellis said firmly, leading her down a sterile corridor. They can't see each other. They can't talk. They can't coordinate. Yet, Klein replied, they stopped outside a reinforced observation room, overlooking a cell block. Through layered glass, Subject H sat motionless on his bed, hands resting on his knees, eyes open but unfocused. He looks like he's already given up, Ellis said. Klein didn't respond. She had seen this posture before. It wasn't defeat. It was patience. Back at headquarters, Reyes uncovered the next thread and connected Calder to something far older than the current case. Years earlier, Calder had overseen a pilot program aimed at reducing violence through predictability. The idea was simple. Structured routines reduce chaos. Automated schedules minimize human error. Standardized responses eliminated favoritism. The program worked. Violence dropped, but so did variability. And in systems theory, variability was friction. Friction slowed exploitation. Remove it, and systems ran smoothly. Too smoothly. Subject H had spent years inside those pilot facilities, watching, learning, cataloging how predictability created opportunity, how men could be guided not by orders, but by environment. He didn't recruit soldiers. He shaped behavior. That was why gangs failed inside ADX Florence. Not because they were weak, but because the prison stripped away the very tools they needed to function. Shared space, shared identity, shared risk. Yet Subject H didn't need any of that. He operated above the gang level, using them as temporary instruments when useful, discarding them when they drew too much attention. The facilitator's death hadn't been punishment. It had been cleanup. As pressure mounted, Calder disappeared. No social presence. No financial activity. His consulting accounts went dormant overnight. A man who had spent decades shaping prisons vanished into the same administrative fog he once controlled. Then came the incident that forced everyone's hand. A correctional officer at a different federal facility collapsed during a routine shift. No trauma. No struggle. Symptoms mirrored those seen in the inmate who had nearly died weeks earlier. Disorientation, cardiac instability, sudden systemic failure. He survived, but investigators found something chilling in his locker. A handwritten note. 6 words. Routine makes you predictable. The handwriting analysis matched subject H's earlier correspondence, documents written years before his transfer to ADX Florence. There was no direct line, no provable communication, but the implication was clear. The influence wasn't confined to inmates. It was leaking outward. Warden Ellis authorized an unprecedented response. Subject H would be placed under full sensory restriction. No terminals, no forms, no discretionary interactions. Every variable eliminated. ADX Florence locked down around him. For the first time since his arrival, the pattern stopped. No coordinated grievances, no anomalies, no echoes. Weeks passed, then months. The Bureau declared victory quietly, careful not to attract attention. Officially, Subject H had been neutralized. Calder remained missing, presumed retired in earnest or deceased. The system breathed again, until a junior analyst flagged a historical discrepancy during a routine audit, a policy update implemented nationwide. One believed to originate from Calder's consulting recommendations, had never been properly vetted. It had been accepted as best practice, embedded so deeply that reversing it would disrupt operations across dozens of facilities. The update standardized emergency response timing, predictable, efficient, exploitable. Klein realized the truth too late. ADX Florence had stopped Subject H, but the system he helped shape was already running on his logic, and that logic didn't require him to be free or alive. As the Bureau scrambled to assess the scope of the damage, Klein received a final message routed through an internal channel no longer in use. No sender, no signature, just one sentence. You built the cage perfectly. You just forgot who studied the blueprint. And as alarms began sounding in a facility thousands of miles away, unrelated, unconnected, officially coincidental, Klein understood the horrifying reality. ADX Florence was unbeatable to gangs because it destroyed collective power. But it was never designed to stop a single mind that didn't need an army. And whatever Subject H had started, he had already passed the point where stopping him mattered, because the final move was already in motion. The first alert came in at 4:42 a.m., not from ADX Florence, not from any facility tied to Subject H. It came from a mid-level federal prison in the Midwest, the kind of place no one watched closely because nothing ever happened there. Low incident rate, stable population, predictable routines. Too predictable. A housing unit supervisor reported an unexplained synchronization failure. Doors unlocking 3 seconds late across an entire wing. Not enough to cause chaos. Not enough to trigger an emergency response. Just enough to register as an anomaly. By itself, it meant nothing. By noon, 3 more facilities reported the same issue. Different states. Different systems. Same delay. Agent Mara Klein stood in the Bureau's Emergency Operations Center, watching the map light up in soft red pulses. Each pulse represented a deviation so small it could be dismissed by any administrator eager to keep their numbers clean. But Klein knew better now. This wasn't disruption. It was calibration. They traced the anomaly to the standardized emergency response timing protocol, the one Calder had championed, the one Subject H had clearly understood. A protocol designed to remove human hesitation had instead removed human judgment. The system no longer reacted. It executed. Inside ADX Florence, Subject H sat alone, as he had for months. The lockdown hadn't changed his posture, his expression, or his routine. He woke when the lights came on. He ate when the slot opened. He slept when the room dimmed. No defiance. No communication. To the outside world, he was finished. Until Warden Ellis received a message marked internal legacy route. The channel hadn't been active in years. The message contained no text, only a timestamp. Ellis froze. The timestamp matched the exact moment the first synchronization failure had occurred. He ordered an immediate review of Subject H's cell systems. Power, lighting, climate control, surveillance. Everything came back nominal. Except one thing. The internal clock governing his cell's automation was off. By exactly 3 seconds. The same delay. Klein arrived at ADX Florence within hours. This time, there was no pretense of control. No speeches about impenetrable systems. Ellis met her in silence, leading her through corridors that suddenly felt less like safeguards and more like arteries. "Tell me the truth," he said finally. "Did we miss something?" Klein stopped outside the observation room. "We misunderstood the threat," she said. "We were looking for communication. He was looking for alignment." They watched Subject H through reinforced glass. He stood now, facing the wall, hands resting lightly against the concrete, as if feeling for vibrations no one else could sense. "He can't access anything," Ellis said. "No terminals. No forms. No discretion." "No," Klein agreed. "But he doesn't need access anymore." She explained it quickly, because time had already become the enemy. Subject H had spent decades inside evolving prison systems. He hadn't just learned how they worked. He had learned how they changed. He knew that every reform followed patterns, pilot programs, phase rollouts, standardization. He didn't need to send instructions. He needed the system to behave the way it was trained to behave. The timing discrepancies weren't failures. They were signals. Proof that the environment itself was now operating on logic he understood better than its designers. Across the country, small incidents began to stack up. Not riots, not escapes, administrative confusion, delayed responses, medical interventions arriving seconds too late, security checks performed out of sequence. No single event crossed the threshold of catastrophe. Together, they formed a chilling mosaic. The Bureau convened an emergency council, policy architects, systems engineers, behavioral analysts. They debated shutdowns, rollbacks, overrides. Every option carried risk. Undoing years of automation would reintroduce chaos. Leaving it in place meant accepting vulnerability. Then the final piece surfaced. Jordan Reyes found it buried in archival correspondence. A draft memo never finalized, written by Calder during the early days of automation. A sentence stood out, underlined in pen. "If the system ever runs without friction, it will run without accountability." Calder hadn't been warning them. He had been explaining himself. The truth snapped into focus with brutal clarity. There was no ongoing conspiracy, no network to dismantle, no gang to defeat. Subject H had proven his point years ago, and Calder had helped encode it into policy. ADX Florence stopped gangs because it annihilated collective identity, but it relied on systems so rigid they could be anticipated, measured, and quietly guided. The prison was perfect, which made it predictable. Klein requested a final meeting with Subject H. Ellis hesitated. He hasn't spoken in months. "That's fine," she said. "I'm not there to ask questions." The meeting room was sparse, colder than the rest of the facility. Subject H entered in restraints, eyes calm, movements unhurried. He sat across from Klein, hands folded, expression unreadable. "You won't reverse it," Klein said, breaking the silence. "Even if you shut everything down, it's already shaped how decisions are made." Subject H didn't smile. "You think this was about damage," he said softly. "It wasn't. Then what was it about?" "Proof," he replied. "That power doesn't belong to gangs, or wardens, or systems. It belongs to whoever understands behavior when no one is watching." Klein studied him. "You're never getting out." "I was never trying to," he said. "Freedom is inefficient." She left the room with a weight in her chest she couldn't name. In the weeks that followed, the Bureau issued quiet revisions. Manual overrides returned. Variability was reintroduced intentionally. Human judgment, with all its flaws, was reinstated as a safeguard. Incidents declined. The map went dark again. Officially, the case ended there. Subject H remains at ADX Florence, isolated, silent, and compliant. Gangs continue to fail inside its walls, unable to recruit, unable to rule, stripped of connections they need to survive. But somewhere in the system, buried in protocols, habits, and routines shaped by decades of reform, the logic he exposed still exists, waiting, because the most secure prison in the world can stop gangs. It can stop violence. It can stop communication. What it can't stop is an idea that's already been built into the machine. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, Because the scariest threats don't come from men breaking out. They come from systems doing exactly what they were designed to do.